When Karl Marx said that the tradition of all their generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, I felt that. Except I don't think being doomed to repeat history is the nightmare. It's the inability to repeat or even have a clear picture of that history that tortures me. Sometimes it's like a shadow, like despite always being with you, it's also still out of your reach. I think you get one white whale in your life, and mine is South African fashion history, and more specifically, trying to understand it outside and beyond colonialism, and this most weighs on my brain around Heritage Day. We're very unlike a lot of other African countries in that it's not a very common, like everyday occurrence to see people in any sort of culturally specific dress. A lot of so-called traditional fashion is mostly reserved for special ceremonies like weddings or initiations, and then of course the 24th of September, Heritage Day. But what's most intriguing to me is that in a country with such ethnic diversity, where it's basically almost impossible to have a singular national costume, like one identifying garment or style of dress, in the way like Germans have drindles or the Vietnamese have ao dai, that whether it's for Heritage Day or special rites of passage or ceremonies, the majority of South Africans turn to shweshwe. A lot of people love to send me that fabric map of Africa, which basically assigns a textile to every African country. And of course, South Africa is represented by shweshwe on this map. And what's interesting about shweshwe is that it's not of indigenous origin like a lot of other African textiles like kente or bark cloth or raffia, but rather something that was brought over from India by Dutch settlers around the 18th, 19th century, maybe even a little bit earlier. And I will be going a lot more into depth about the history and journey of shweshwe from Asia and how it grew to be an integral part of cultural identity for so many Southern African people in my podcast, Clothes Minded, available wherever you get your podcasts. But for now, what I want to explore is how shweshwe is like, it's like that dinosaur chicken nugget meme where a trace of the true self exists even in the false self. Because despite being of Asian origin and brought over by European traders and colonialists, shweshwe, which wasn't always called that either, is just indigo cloth. And across this continent, there are so many instances of a long-running preference for patterned blue or blue and white fabrics. I think that we often assume that because something is brought over in these less than ethical circumstances, that it was just sort of imposed upon our ancestors, but they actually had a lot more agency than we're led to believe. After all, these European traders, whether the Portuguese, Dutch, or British, were operating businesses, and all businesses are in many ways servants to their target markets. You can't really sell people things that they don't want. I'm pretty sure there's a whole other term for that. And so many of the African markets that they were serving throughout the 18th and 19th centuries were very discerning about what textiles they would accept and adopt. And so it appears that actually the reason that a lot of these Asian and later European made indigo textiles were so well received in Africa was because that they were actually already very similar to things we were already producing. And that's sort of how there's a trace of the true self even in the false self. So for Heritage Day this year, I wanted to explore creating my own shweshwe in a sense, but more taking inspiration from historical African indigo cloth. And of course, it's like wild to speak about indigo without talking about denim, which is doubly interesting because shweshwe is sometimes referred to as the denim of South Africa. So for my little venture, I decided to bleach paint my own patterns and motifs onto denim offcuts and then transform them into this Victorian gown, which was inspired by this image of an unnamed Black family in Johannesburg during this time period, but particularly this young woman, like she just looks so slay. And I'm focusing on this era not only because I'm an absolute sucker for Gilded Age silhouettes and design, but this is also the earliest period where I feel like we see Black people having like some sort of control over how they're visually represented, at least within this like Western context or globalized context, colonialized context, however you like it. And when I look at a lot of images from this time, be it South Africa or America, what I enjoy in a twisted way is seeing the ways in which people cultivated grace and dignity for themselves in what were pretty terrible times, I suspect. And it's also much more interesting when we bring denim into the picture because there's also the implications of cotton farming and chattel slavery, along with its connections to the working class and like various civil rights movements. And then also, of course, who would I be if I wasn't also thinking of the sustainability implications? You know, in a very ironic twist of fate, this very egalitarian of the people textile has a really harmful environmental footprint that really impacts the same people it supposedly like serves and equalizes, right? Like according to Levi's, making a single pair of jeans requires over 3,000 liters of water. And we know these kinds of burdens are often carried by people in the global south. If you look to the epidemic of waste colonialism in Africa, or polluted water supplies, and also the destabilization of regional textile industries. That was a bit of a mouthful. But I'm going to leave the environment aspect at that because I appreciate most people do not want to hear it. And I find it's also easier to make a connection or provide value in looking at sustainability from a more cultural preservation lens as well, which is essentially what's kind of got me into fashion history in the first place. To go back to my boy Karl Marx, who in that same essay says, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already given and transmitted from the past." And not that I've read this essay in its entirety or really understood it. I mostly learned about this whole thing from a Kamala Harris meme. But what I find somewhat comforting, sometimes disturbing, is that in my attempts to capture and understand this underrepresented and difficult to access history, is that while my heritage might feel like a shadow and that it's not always visible, it is always present and always with me. So thanks for taking this little journey with me. This project was actually meant to be much more detailed, like I'm talking embroidery and beading, but I've recently become unemployed or fun employed. So I kind of burnt myself out this September from all the freelancing work that I have to take on now, and I ended up getting sick for an entire week, which really messed up with my schedule, and I also have so many other projects and stuff going on. So this is a lot more like the beginning of an exploration into like creating my own shweshwe. I also want to take the time to really develop like the symbols and motifs and assign more meaning to them. I kind of just freehanded a lot of this. I was really vibing out when I was doing this. But I think it'd be really cool to maybe like draw on like cave paintings from Limpopo, where like my ancestors are from, or also playing around with other methods of like dyeing and patterning, like wax, mud, or even using actual indigo. And also hopefully as I start learning more things, I might find some more like pre-colonial garments to recreate. I don't know yet. But if you are interested in learning more about Southern African fashion history, you can find my podcast linked in the description. I'm still working on the shweshwe episode, which has been a little bit tough in that I've been struggling to get more Black voices on the topic, but that should be out by the end of October. And if you'd like to support me and the podcast, I've just recently set up a Patreon where for as little as $1 a month, you'll get access to my research notes, you'll get full-length interviews from the podcast, you can make content requests, and also eventually I'm working on getting some sewing patterns digitized, which will be available as PDF downloads, and I think I'll maybe also will accompany that with some tutorials. $1 is the lowest amount that they let you do there, but if you'd rather make a one-off contribution, you don't have to commit to an entire monthly subscription. You can donate any amount to my Buy Me a Beer account. Mostly I use all that money to pay my podcast producer, fund some of the resources for these projects, and once in a while also buy myself a beer. But also you do not have to support me financially. It's not like I am unemployed or anything. I'm always really happy. You can check out, you can subscribe to my newsletter. It's called Hanger Management. You can follow me on Instagram or TikTok. I am at OKBaddyK. My goal for October is to hit 66.6 thousand followers. Because I'm on 661 posts, so eventually I will have 666 posts and then 66.6 followers, and I think that'll just be really funny to do for spooky season. Let's smoke a cigarette and talk about it. Let's have a cigarette.